All right, so you've brought us these articles all about what's been happening since the Israel-Hamas ceasefire.
Yeah.
And, on the surface, it seems like, okay, greatest step towards peace,
Right.
but obviously it's way more complicated.
Absolutely. We're talking about over a year, 15 months,
Mhm.
actually, of intense conflict.
Right.
And even with this ceasefire agreement, things are not, clear cut.
Yeah, because one of the things that I found kind of jarring was that even after the ceasefire was announced, there were reports of continued violence.
Right.
Like it says here, 73 people killed in Israeli airstrikes after the ceasefire was announced.
Yeah.
Many of them women and children.
Tragic.
That detail, really, it's from the Hamas-run health ministry and the doctor's testimony from Gaza City's Baptist Hospital.
Right.
It's really concerning.
Yeah. And it is a tragic situation. And while it might seem like a contradiction,
Yeah.
surges in violence right before a ceasefire takes hold are not unheard of. Sometimes there's a final push by one or both sides, maybe trying to gain a last-minute advantage.
Gaining leverage or something like that.
Exactly.
Wow. So how do they even, how can you build trust for a lasting peace if you can't even agree on, what happened during those critical hours?
Well, that's the challenge, and that's where this blame game that we're seeing unfold really comes into play.
Right, because Netanyahu's accusing Hamas of backtracking on the deal, at the last minute.
Uh-huh.
Even using really strong language, like extorting last-minute concession.
Very strong language.
And then on the other side, you have Hamas officials like Sami Abu Zuri just completely denying those accusations.
Yeah, I mean, it's classic strategic communication in these kinds of conflicts.
Right.
Each side wants to appear strong and in control.
Right, to their own people.
Exactly, even if it might ultimately undermine the long-term goal of peace.
So it's like they're thinking short term.
In a way.
Yeah. Yeah. This is high stakes. We're talking about the release of hostages, including Americans and Palestinian prisoners.
Right.
I was reading about Jonathan Dekelchen, the father of a Hamas hostage, and his just anxiety over this delayed vote on the deal really humanizes it all.
It doesn't. And, hostage releases, they can be very symbolic, aimed at building trust, demonstrating goodwill.
Right.
But they can also be used as bargaining chips.
Right. So again, you're saying it's a very complex situation.
Very much so.
So we've got this ceasefire, but it's fragile. There's a lot of mistrust. There's a human cost. And then you look at Netanyahu, he seems to be walking this political tightrope.
He really is in a precarious position.
Yeah. The articles talk about the pressure he's getting from his own right-wing coalition partners. Figures like Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir.
Right. Very powerful figures.
Yeah. They're threatening to leave the government if he approves the deal, which could trigger new elections, weaken his position.
It's a tough spot to be in.
So he's fighting two battles, one with Hamas and one within his own government.
It seems that way.
Yeah, and then on top of all of this, you have to rebuild Gaza.
Yeah, the scale of the destruction is just incredible.
It's mind-boggling. I mean, one of the articles quotes the UN Development Programme's Akeem Steiner, calling it a very complex undertaking.
And he's not wrong.
I mean, we're talking about 40 million tons of rubble, displaced families, no basic infrastructure.
It's going to take a massive coordinated effort.
Yeah, and I mean, so not only do they have to figure out this ceasefire, but they have to rebuild in a way that, leads to lasting peace.
Absolutely, because if the reconstruction process is seen as unfair or if it's mismanaged, it could easily lead to more tension and conflict down the road.
So it seems like the real work is just beginning.
I think that's a fair assessment.
So we've covered a lot in this first part. We've talked about the ceasefire, or at least the attempt at a ceasefire. We've talked about the blame game, the human costs of the political maneuvering, and the just massive task of rebuilding Gaza.
It's a lot to take in.
But there's still so much more to explore, right?
There is, and we'll delve deeper into all of these complexities in part 2, so be sure to join us then.
So we were just talking about this massive reconstruction effort that's needed in Gaza.
Yeah.
It's hard to even grasp the scale of it all.
It is really, it's staggering when you think about it. That number we talk about, 40 million tons of rubble.
Right.
That's like the weight of over 5,000 Eiffel Towers.
Wow.
And that's just the physical debris. We're not even talking about the psychological and social rebuilding that has to happen.
Right. You can get lost in those big numbers, but behind each statistic is a real person, whose life has been completely shattered.
Absolutely.
It's going to take years, if not decades, to rebuild.
At least.
And the sources we have paint a very challenging picture.
Yeah, you have multiple countries and aid organizations all trying to coordinate their efforts.
Yeah.
While also navigating the political sensitivities and the ongoing tensions between Israel and Hamas.
It's a lot.
It is.
And it makes me think about, how this reconstruction process could either help or hurt the peace process.
Right.
If it's done right, it could be this powerful symbol of cooperation,
Yeah.
a foundation for a better future. But if it's mismanaged...
Oh, it could easily become another source of conflict.
Absolutely.
Every decision made during this reconstruction is going to be scrutinized.
Oh, for sure.
And it could have long-term consequences.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder what role the international community will play in making sure that this reconstruction actually contributes to lasting peace.
Mm-hmm.
What levers do they have to encourage cooperation and prevent further conflict?
Well, there's the financial aspect, of course.
Right.
The international community is going to be providing a significant portion of the funding.
Okay.
But there's also the diplomatic aspect.
Right.
Using their influence to encourage dialogue,
Uh-huh.
transparency, accountability.
So the money itself, the aid, could be a tool to incentivize, good behavior.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then there's the question of who's actually going to be involved in the rebuilding.
Yeah.
Will it be international companies, local contractors, or a mix of both?
Right.
How do you ensure that the process benefits the people of Gaza directly
Right.
and doesn't become a source of corruption or exploitation?
So many factors.
A lot to consider.
And it makes you think about the political realities on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking earlier about the pressure that Netanyahu is facing from his right-wing coalition.
Yeah.
Do you think that could impact the reconstruction?
Oh, absolutely. If Netanyahu's government is perceived as being too conciliatory towards Hamas, during the reconstruction, it could further inflame tensions within his own coalition.
Right.
Potentially even lead to its collapse.
So he's really walking a tightrope here.
He is trying to balance those international pressures for peace
Right.
with the demands of his own political base.
And it's not just Netanyahu, right?
No, not at all. Hamas is facing its own internal challenges.
Right, of course.
You have some factions within Hamas that might see this reconstruction as an opportunity to rearm, to regroup,
Okay.
while others might be more focused on just, providing basic needs for the people.
Yeah.
How Hamas manages these internal divisions will also play a role
Yeah.
in the success or failure of the reconstruction.
Feels like every step forward, there's 2 steps back.
It's a constant push and pull.
Yeah. Can this ceasefire, even if it holds, can it actually lead to a lasting peace when there are so many competing interests and so much mistrust?
I think that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's a question that we can't answer right now.
Right.
And we're still very much in the early stages of this process.
Yeah, and there are a lot of unknowns.
A lot of unknowns.
It's overwhelming.
It is overwhelming,
Yeah.
but it's also, I think, a reminder that peace building is not a linear process.
Yeah.
It's messy. It's unpredictable. It requires a lot of patience, persistence, and a willingness to engage with all of these complexities.
So where do we go from here?
Well, that's the question we're going to explore further in part 3.
We've spent a lot of time in this deep dive just trying to figure out what the ceasefire really means.
Yeah.
Not just in the short term, but, for the long haul.
Yeah. I think it's safe to say it's pretty precarious.
It really is. It's like every time we peel back a layer, we just find more and more complexity.
Right.
It's not just about stopping the fighting. It's about, the underlying reasons,
exactly.
that caused the conflict in the first place.
You have to address the root causes.
And one thing that I thought was really interesting in these articles was how much they talked about, the emotional and psychological, impact of this conflict on both sides.
Absolutely.
It's not just about the buildings and, the physical destruction.
Right.
It's about the trauma, the fear that's been built up over years.
Decades even.
Yeah. Yeah. So any kind of lasting peace agreement, you can't just focus on the political stuff.
Nope.
It's got to address those deeper...
Those psychological and emotional needs, absolutely.
Yeah. It's about healing, isn't it?
Yeah. It's about reconciliation. It's about finding a way to live together after so much
right.
pain and loss.
It sounds impossible.
It's incredibly difficult.
How do you even begin to do that when there's so much anger and resentment?
It's not easy, but it's not impossible.
Okay.
There are examples from around the world, of communities that have overcome these seemingly, insurmountable divisions.
Yeah.
It often starts with small steps.
Okay.
People-to-people initiatives, dialogue groups, cultural exchanges.
Like trying to see each other as human.
Exactly. Humanizing the other, breaking down those stereotypes.
So almost like a ground-up approach.
Yeah, you need both. You need the top-down approach, like the political negotiations, but you also need that bottom-up grassroots peace building.
Okay, so two tracks happening at the same time.
In a sense, yeah. And let's not forget, the international community has a role to play here, too.
They do. They have a lot of influence.
They do. We talked earlier about the financial and diplomatic leverage. Well, how can they use that to really encourage a lasting peace?
What would that look like?
Well, they can provide incentives for cooperation, right? Things like economic aid, trade agreements.
Right.
But they can also, impose sanctions or other penalties.
So it's like a carrot and stick approach.
Sort of. Huh? But it's also about providing support for those grassroots efforts.
Oh, okay.
Funding dialogue groups, educational programs, cultural exchanges.
So it's kind of like a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah, you need to address the political, the economic, the social, the psychological.
All of it.
All of it. It's a massive undertaking.
A lot, yeah.
And it's important to be realistic. There are going to be setbacks. There will be spoilers.
Right.
There will be moments when it feels like there's no hope.
It's easy to get discouraged.
It is. But it's important to remember that peace is a journey. It's not a destination.
Yeah.
It's not about achieving some perfect state of peace.
Yeah.
It's about striving for something better.
Just keep moving forward.
Exactly, one step at a time.
Well, this has been a really, it's been heavy.
It has.
But there's some hope in it, too.
There is.
I mean, it's clear that there's a long road ahead, but there are people working for peace,
Absolutely, on both sides and around the world.
And those efforts deserve our attention.
They do. They deserve our support and our hope.
Well said. So where would you point our listener if they want to, explore this further?
Oh, there's some amazing organizations doing great work, like the Parent Circle Families Forum, Combatants for Peace, the Perry Center for Peace and Innovation, just to name a few.
Wow.
They all have resources, educational programs, opportunities to get involved.
So even in the midst of all this,
what?
There's still people dedicated to building a better future.
Absolutely.
That's inspiring.
And remember, even if you're not, directly involved in this conflict, you can still make a difference.
How?
Stay informed, engage in thoughtful conversations, challenge prejudice and stereotypes, support those working for peace. Every voice counts.
What a great message to end on. Thank you so much for guiding us through this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
It's been really insightful.
Glad to hear it.
And to our listener, we hope you found this deep dive informative and thought-provoking. And, the path to peace really starts with understanding, empathy, and a commitment to, making a better world.
Couldn't agree more.
So we encourage you to keep learning, keep exploring this issue.
Yes, stay curious.
And find ways to engage in the conversation.
Until next time.